To the slides we go. We're going to begin with the powers of the president, or presidential powers, as laid out in the Constitution. And so the idea for the assignment on the presidents is to see how those 5 presidents and their time in office, did it expand upon the original powers that we're going to be looking at that are found in the Constitution. There are 5 express powers laid out in Article 2 of the Constitution: executive, diplomatic, legislative, military, and judicial powers. Now I'm going to turn to the textbook now. As we look at these powers. Quickly, because I don't have a Kahoots ready and we got class members missing, so we won't do that. Why was the executive branch not the first branch listed? And what were the anti-federalists and some federalists afraid of concerning an executive branch? Breaking away from England and setting up our own government. Why did they want the legislative branch to be the most, in their eyes,
to stop the others from abusing their powers, right?
That's one reason, but there's a key reason as we broke away from England why they didn't want the executive to be all powerful.
I don't know. I don't know.
Well,
I know, but I don't know how to say it. So I'm just not gonna say it.
who did the Declaration of Independence criticize chiefly?
England,
Huh?
King George.
King George, yeah. So they didn't want to set up a government where an executive could become like another king
Oh
in
yeah.
colonies. So legislative branch is got a little bit more teeth to it, and they did not want the chief executive officer or the president to abuse power and become another monarch. Very quickly, before we look at the powers, qualifications of a person who wants to be president: you have to be a natural born citizen, which includes people who might be born outside of the United States, but maybe they were born, maybe their parents, maybe they had a dad who served as an ambassador, let's say to England, and that person was born in London. They're still a naturalized citizen. I'm only aware of one president where their birthplace was a major issue, and that was Obama. Obama was born in Hawaii, but many people felt like he was born, I think, in Nigeria or Kenya, because his dad was Nigerian or Kenyan. I can't remember which one it was. So a natural born citizen, 35 years or older, must have lived in the United States for at least 14 years. So if you were born in London, before you can run for president, you would have had to been living in the States for 14 plus years. During the first campaign that Obama ran, he ran against a Republican named John McCain. John McCain was born overseas, as his dad was a military general or a major. So he was born on a United States base outside of the US. But he had since lived in the United States for 14 years. And then, whereas there's no term limits for senators or representatives, there is a 2-term limit for presidents. And this came about with the 26th Amendment, because up until that point, there was no stipulation in the Constitution that a president could only serve twice. Now, because George Washington, who was our first president, stepped down after his second term, he kind of set an example and a precedent that, presidents, to show that they're not power hungry, they don't want to be a dictator, would step down voluntarily. That's what Washington did, because they would have let Washington stay president until he died. But he willingly stepped down after 2 terms. That kind of became a precedent that most presidents followed up until FDR. So those of you who got Franklin Roosevelt, Lauren and Kennedy, that might be something to look into. Franklin Roosevelt didn't step down after a second term. He was nominated and had a 3rd term, and then he got elected for a 4th term, but then he died during the 4th term. So after his presidency, the 26th Amendment put a limit on how many terms presidents could serve. So only 2 terms. And there were a lot of people afraid that Trump would try to get that 26th Amendment changed so that he could run for more than 2 terms, as Trump definitely has clearly expressed power-hungry tendencies. All right, so the only person in the room that could be a presidential nominee would be yours truly. I know I don't look 35, but I'm a little bit over that. Okay, let's look at these express powers that are clearly spelled out in the Constitution. These 5 categories. When it comes to our nation's military or armed forces branch, the president is the commander-in-chief. So there is the military category. In other words, he is the commander over all the branches and over the generals in each branch, the major generals, as well as the majors themselves, those that are high up in the military. He is their commander-in-chief. Now, one thing that the president cannot do when it comes to this branch, because Congress can only do it, is what? Does anybody know? The framers said Congress can do this, the executive, the president cannot, when it comes to our armed forces. All right. Congress is the one that has the power to declare war, not the president. Although in the last, since World War I think the textbook points this out. After Japan bombed Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, our Congress did declare war on Japan. But ever since then, Congress has not declared a war on anybody. The presidents have kind of led the way in that. The judicial category of express powers has to do with duties that the president performs that are similar to a court, right? The word judicial. So the president can do things that the Supreme Court doesn't do. And mainly, the president can pardon people for offenses against the United States, except for anybody who's been impeached. Now, the president is not the only federal officer that can be impeached. Federal judges can be impeached. Congressmen and senators. Well, I'm not sure about that. But there have been federal judges that have been impeached and removed from office. Unlike the 3 presidents that have been impeached, they have not been removed. But the president cannot impeach anybody, but he can, or he cannot pardon someone who has been impeached. But the president does have the power to pardon those who commit offenses against the United States and to grant reprieves. One of the most famous pardons in United States history, I told you Wednesday about Richard Nixon, was probably going to be, he was going to be impeached and most likely would have been removed, but he resigned before they could do that. His vice president, Gerald Ford, became president. And one of the first things that Ford did was pardon Richard Nixon. Very, very controversial thing because so many people wanted Nixon to be taken to trial. And there were several men within Nixon's inner circle who did get convicted in jail time, but Nixon did not. He was pardoned. Gerald Ford felt like that was something that was needed for the healing of the nation, but very controversial. A third classification of, or a third area of powers for the presidency is diplomatic powers. The president is basically our chief diplomat. That is in relationship to other nations. The president has power to make treaties with other countries, but notice here, there is a limitation to that. He must have the advice and consent of the Senate. Do you all remember, well, there's a picture here in the book. Do you remember President Trump meeting with this guy, North Korea's leader, Kim Jong-un? And, you know, he, let's just say, in theory, he and Kim Jong-un decided to make a treaty. And let's just say, using our imagination, they're shaking hands here, and this is the copy of the treaty. Trump could not come back to the United States and say, I have made a treaty with North Korea and it is now binding. No, 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 no. He would have had, the Congress would have said, no, there's no treaty there. Because he has to have the advice and consent of the legislative branch to make a treaty. All right. And within that function as the chief diplomat, he receives ambassadors and other public ministers from other nations. Of course, being the executive branch, he has a category of executive powers. The president is responsible to see that all laws are faithfully executed. So laws that are passed by Congress that come across the president's desk and he signs them into law. He and his branch are then responsible to see that those laws are executed. When we get to the part about the presidency, about the office of the presidency, or the presidency as an institution, because the presidency is more than just one person. It's a whole institution. As we're going to see in our textbook, there's 4 different components to the institution of the presidency. Parts of those components are responsible for seeing that laws that are passed are then applied and obeyed. And then the president has a 5th category of express powers, and that is the legislative category. Now notice that it's similar to, well, it's the exact same word. So he's going to have some similar functions to the legislative branch. And so this category gives the president power to participate with authority in the legislative process. All right, so looking a little bit more closely at these 5 express powers, when it comes to the military power, the president is referred to as the commander-in-chief, the highest military authority in the United States, with control of the entire defense establishment. You all have heard of the nuclear codes? Yes or no? So the president has a briefcase that contains the nuclear codes to our nuclear weapons. That is kind of representative of his authority as the chief military officer in our nation. Now, the diplomatic function is found within the military function. No, I'm sorry, here it is down there. In the military role, he also, his power in the military role extends into the, I'm sorry, I was thinking diplomatic, into the domestic sphere of life. In other words, under his leadership, the United States has the power and the responsibility to protect every state in the Union against invasion and domestic violence. So the military aspect is not just with foreign nations going overseas into foreign areas and engaging in conflict. For example, when we'll see how these two things are tied together. September 11th, 2001, the Taliban attacks us on our homeland. So a foreign invader unleashes an attack, domestic attack in our country. And so since the president has the responsibility as the chief, as the commander in chief, he then has that power and authority to lead in defending and protecting the United States of America. So that was kind of a meshing of the two: foreign invaders, domestic protection, that is seen within the military power of the presidency. There have been presidents also that have made use of the military within the United States to enforce law. President Eisenhower in 1957, sending in troops into Little Rock, Arkansas, to see that the Arkansas government would enforce the Supreme Court's laws that schools be integrated. All right, any questions on that? All right, judicial power, once again, the power for the president has the power to pardon individuals or grant reprieves or to give amnesty to a person or people who are fleeing their nation. That would mean someone fleeing their nation whose life is in danger, coming to America to be protected, to have amnesty. Presidents can grant that. Now, I mentioned to you a very famous one of Richard Nixon being pardoned by Gerald Ford. Another fairly well-known case of pardons was President Andrew Johnson. He was Lincoln's vice president. He became president after Lincoln was assassinated. And in 1868, he gave full amnesty to all Southerners who had participated in the Civil War. So those are some examples of presidents using their judicial power. All right, we already touched on diplomatic power with the example of Trump and Kim Jong-un. Executive power. This is the most important, probably the most, what we would think of as the first and foremost responsibility, since this is the executive branch. But the president must see to it that all laws are faithfully executed. This is Article 2, Section 3. And then Article 2, Section 2 says that the president will appoint and supervise all executive officers and appoint all federal judges. All executive officers and appoint all federal judges. But notice here, with Senate approval. So the president doesn't have absolute power in this area of appointing executive officers and federal judges. And this is most clearly seen in the recent Supreme Court nominees that Trump had and then Biden had with the new the newest Supreme Court Justice, Mrs. Jackson. The president appoints them, but then Congress, specifically the Senate, has to approve them. What would that be an example of? Remember, in setting up our government, the framers didn't want one branch or one person to have too much concentration of power. So what is the Senate having to give their approval to a Supreme Court justice nominee? What is that an example of? Does anybody remember what that's called?
Are you talking about the checks and balances?
Yes, checks and balances. That is the Senate keeping a check on presidential power getting out of control. One of the things that you'll hear a lot today concerning the president's executive power is executive privilege. This is the claim that communications between a president and his close advisors should not ever be revealed unless the president gives consent. Right now, our Department of Justice is investigating Trump taking the highly classified documents, right? You guys are familiar with that? One of the things that Trump claimed was that he could take those files because they're highly classified between him and his officials, and he wanted to invoke executive privilege. The only thing is not all of those, not all files are, not all highly classified files or all communications between the president and his people, his counselors, his advisors. Not all of those are eligible to receive executive privilege. An important, a good example of this was, we go back to Richard Nixon. After he resigned, or actually before he resigned, this is kind of what led to him resigning. Richard Nixon was a very paranoid president. He had installed within the White House a recording system, set up these recorders all over the White House so that he was recording all the conversations that were going on. Surveillance. And this was not known by the legislative branch or the judicial branch. It was only known by Nixon and some of his inner circle. Well, when they started investigating all of Nixon's inner circle, one of those persons revealed that there is a surveillance system in the White House. Well, Congress wanted those tapes. Nixon said, nope, that's executive privilege. Congress said, no, it's not. We're subpoenaing those tapes. And it was when that happened that Nixon resigned. So we'll stop there and finish up the presidency on Monday. Any questions? So look for chapter 13 worksheet and then the presidential assignment over the weekend. We'll see you Monday.